June 12, 1854. Plantation fields near Natchez, Mississippi. The ground was wet with blood, still steaming in the dawn air. 3 men lay broken, their mouths frozen in a last cry they never finished. Ezekiel Brown, that was the name of the man who, armed with a hammer and a fury older than himself, forever changed the fate of the Fairchild plantation. He was 28 years old, a blacksmith by trade, broad-shouldered from years of fire and iron, born into chains but forged into something unbreakable. But that night, Ezekiel did not bend steel for his master. He did not shoe horses or mend hinges. He did not bow. Ezekiel killed. The hammer came down with a sound like wet wood splitting, and the overseer's jaw shattered as if it were glass under weight. This is the true story of Ezekiel Brown, a slave who decided that this night would not be a night of prayer and silence, but of justice. Before we continue with the video, drop a comment telling us where you're from and what time it is over there. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel. The morning light crept slowly across the Mississippi earth, stretching long shadows over the rows of cotton. The Fairchild plantation sprawled like a wound across the land, its white columns of the main house rising arrogantly above the fields. The air was thick with humidity, a weight that pressed down on lungs, and every breath tasted of soil, sweat, and sorrow. Birds began to stir in the trees, their songs faint against the silence that clung to the cabins. The cabins stood in crooked lines, rough pine boards that barely kept out rain, each one smelling of damp earth and smoke. It was in these cabins that Ezekiel lived, though living was too generous a word. His nights were short, stolen by exhaustion, his mornings early, claimed by labor. The forge was his world, a small outbuilding of cracked stone and scorched tie, embers, always alive with fire. Inside it, the iron spoke, and Ezekiel listened. He had arms hardened by the anvil, calluses that felt like stone, and eyes that burned quietly with something no one dared to name. He moved like steam, slow, quiet, necessary. The Fairchilds thought his silence was obedience. They mistook his bowed head for surrender, his steady hands for docility. But his silence wasn't always surrender. Sometimes it was a storm waiting for a crack in the sky, and that storm had been brewing for years. Ezekiel's mother, Ruth, had been brought from Virginia in chains when she was just 16. She gave birth to him in a field hut. No midwife, no mercy, just pain and sweat under the eyes of an overseer who threatened to whip her if she made too much noise. Ezekiel grew up in the shadow of iron shackles, hearing the cries of women torn from children, the screams of men whipped until their skin turned into rivers of red. From the start, he understood that the land itself was heavy with memory, soaked with the suffering of those who had walked before him. The Fairchild family was known in Natchez. Samuel Fairchild, the master, was a man of broad face and colder eyes. He liked to present himself as a gentleman, quoting scripture at the table while sipping brandy, but his temper was a serpent that struck without warning. His wife, Marianne, pretended refinement, but she was cruel in quiet ways. A withheld meal, a mocking smile when a child cried of hunger. But it was not Samuel or Marianne who held Ezekiel's attention the most. It was the overseer, Thomas Kane. Thomas Kane was a man who believed cruelty was power. He wore his whip as if it were a second skin, letting it coil and snap for sport. He would lean against fence posts and watch women draw water, his eyes lingering too long, his smirk a silent violation. When the lash cracked, he laughed. His boots were always polished, though they were stained with the blood of those he beat. Ezekiel had seen Kane break men in the field, driving them past exhaustion, then punishing them when they collapsed. He had watched him drag a young boy by the hair across the dirt, kicking him for not picking fast enough. And Ezekiel had felt the sting of that whip himself, once, when the forge fire burned too low and Kane accused him of slacking. The mark across his back never faded. What they didn't know was that each lash, Each insult, each theft of dignity was a nail hammered into something Ezekiel was building inside himself. Not with iron and fire, but with silence and fury. The catalyst came one summer evening when the air was thick enough to choke and the sky hung low with thunderclouds. Ezekiel had returned from the forge late, his arms aching, his body dripping with sweat. At the cabins, he found a crowd gathered, their faces pale with fear. He pushed through and saw her, his younger sister Lydia, only 17. Her dress was torn at the shoulder, her face streaked with tears, and her eyes stared blankly into the ground. Thomas Cain had taken her. That was the night something inside Ezekiel stopped being what it was. Not to them, to the Fairchilds, to Cain. He was never human. But to himself, something had shifted. He wasn't broken. He was burning, slow, controlled, waiting. The storm had found its crack in the sky. From that moment, Ezekiel's silence took on a new weight. He did his work, bent steel and hammered nails, but every strike of the hammer was a rehearsal. Every shape of iron was a practice for what he would one day do. He studied Cain's habits, the way he circled the cabins at dusk, the sound of his boots on gravel. He watched Samuel Fairchild in the evenings, how he retired to his study after dinner, leaving his keys carelessly on the desk. He noticed Marianne's nightly routine of visiting the wine cellar alone, clutching her lantern. He tasumbered, as naming them one by one, like curses whispered in the dark. Each day at the forge, Ezekiel tested edges, weighing balance in his hands, listening to the song of steel. He shaped horseshoes that could have been blades, hinges that could have been knives. And in secret, when no one watched, he forged weapons. A hammer, heavy and blunt, its head darkened so it would not catch the light. A knife, long and narrow, wrapped in leather for silence. An iron hook, sharpened to a cruel point. These were not tools of his trade. These were promises. The air grew still around the plantation in those weeks. Not quiet, still, like breath holding itself back. Men and women felt it in their bones, though they could not name it. The fields rustled differently. The nights carried a charge, as though the very earth knew what was coming. And Ezekiel waited. He waited until the night of June 12, 1854. That was the night the storm broke. The morning after Cain had taken Lydia, the fields moved in silence. Women bent over the cotton rows, their hands trembling, and men pushed their sacks forward without speaking. The usual muttered prayers, the whispered songs that rose like thin threads of comfort, were gone. Silence had descended like a heavy fog. Ezekiel worked the forge that day, each strike of the hammer louder than usual, echoing across the yard. The iron rang like a bell tolling, like a summons. Cain passed by the doorway once, his whip coiled loosely at his side, his grin sharp. Ezekiel did not look up. His eyes stayed on the fire, but his grip on the hammer whitened. They thought he was bending to the work. What they didn't know was that he was burning with every breath. The Fairchild plantation stretched wide across rolling Mississippi ground, bordered by dense oak woods to the east and the river to the west. The soil was fertile, black as spilled ink, and it yielded crop after crop of cotton. Samuel Fairchild loved to boast of his wealth, his empire of white, as he called it. But the cost of that empire was written on the scarred backs and weary faces of the enslaved. Ezekiel's days began before sunrise. The bell clanged, harsh and metallic, calling them from their cabins. The fields swallowed them in rows, bent backs moving in unison as the overseers patrolled. At the forge, Ezekiel was spared the field's endless bending, but his reprieve was its own chain. His arms ached from the hammer, his lungs blackened from the smoke. His food was barely enough to keep his body moving. Corn mush, dried pork rinds, sometimes nothing but water. And every evening, when the work was done, Cain made his rounds. His boots struck the dirt in steady rhythm, click, 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 his shadow stretching across doorways. Children hid under straw, women drew their shawls tight, and men clenched their jaws helpless. Cain was more than overseer. He was a reminder that cruelty could come any night, at any moment, without reason. It was in those evenings that Ezekiel sat by the forge even after the fire had dimmed. He stared into the coals, watching their slow glow. Each ember whispered to him, "Not yet, but soon." Ezekiel's father, Joseph, had been a blacksmith too, before he was sold south to Louisiana when Ezekiel was 8. Ezekiel remembered the sound of his father's laugh, deep and rumbling, like an anvil struck in joy. He remembered the day Joseph taught him to hold a hammer, guiding his small hands. "Iron listens," Joseph had said. "It remembers what you tell it." Joseph's absence was a hollow that never filled. For years Ezekiel had dreamed of him, sometimes alive, sometimes in chains, sometimes already buried in strange soil. He learned early that loss was the only inheritance slavery guaranteed. But he had his mother Ruth and his sister Lydia. Ruth was quiet but firm, a woman whose eyes carried more history than her lips ever spoke. She kept Ezekiel alive with scraps of wisdom whispered in the dark. Silence doesn't mean you're beaten. Silence can be waiting. Her silence wasn't always surrender. Sometimes it was a storm waiting for a crack in the sky. Lydia was different. She was sunlight in a place that had none. She sang as she worked, soft hymns that bent around sorrow and found slivers of hope. Her laughter was fragile, a bird too delicate for the cage. When Cain dragged her into the dark, Ezekiel saw that light dim, and he knew it would never return the same. That was the breaking point. The transformation didn't come suddenly. It came like coals heating under ash, slow, steady, unseen until the moment of flame. Ezekiel began to watch differently. He studied not only Cain's boots, but the way Samuel Fairchild handled his keys. He noted how Marianne, after supper, carried her lantern into the wine cellar alone for longer than necessary. He observed the younger son, Edward Fairchild, who drank heavily at night, stumbling to his bedchamber with the carelessness of entitlement. Each of them had patterns. Each of them had weaknesses. He was naming them one by one, like curses whispered in the dark. Samuel Fairchild, the master who owned bodies as if they were cattle. Marianne Fairchild, the mistress who smiled at suffering. Thomas Cain, the whip, the predator in boots. Edward Fairchild, the drunken son who jeered at women like they were nothing but playthings. Ezekiel whispered their names as he shaped the metal, each syllable a hammer strike. Samuel, Marianne, Cain, Edward. Iron listened, Iro, and remembered. In the weeks that followed, Ezekiel's planning grew methodical. He began with tools that no one would question. A hammer, blackened, thick, its weight comforting in his palm. It was a blacksmith's hammer, no more suspicious than a plow in the field. But in Ezekiel's hand, it was a weapon waiting. Then came the knife. He forged it thin, so it could slide silent into the night. He quenched it in oil, not water, to keep the metal dark, without shine. The handle he wrapped in leather strips, worn from a harness, soft to grip, silent against sweat. The hook was his invention, an iron curve sharpened to a cruel point, something that could catch, pull, tear. He tested its edge on scrap leather, watching it part clean, easy. He hid these weapons beneath loose boards in the forge, where ash drifted like snow, covering them from careless eyes. Every night he rehearsed in silence. He lifted the hammer, felt its swing, its weight, He pressed the knife against straw dummies, practicing angles. He held the hook in his fist, imagining Cain's smug smile disappearing under its bite. And in his mind, he walked the paths of the plantation. From the cabins, past the oak trees, across the yard to the main house. He counted his steps, memorized the creak of certain boards, the flicker of lantern light. He wasn't just planning. He was carving a map of vengeance into his memory. But vengeance alone wasn't enough. He thought of Lydia, of Ruth, of the men and women who bent their backs in the fields. He thought of the children who didn't know laughter without fear. Every act he imagined wasn't just for him. Each blow was not just an act, it was a name reclaimed. He had them, all of them, sitting with him in the quiet hours. Samuel, Marianne, Cain, Edward, and alongside them, Ruth, Lydia, Joseph. The boy dragged through the dirt, the men whipped until they bled, the women silenced on for Ruth, one for Lydia, one for Joseph, one for every name the Fairchilds thought they had erased. Ezekiel wasn't broken. He was burning, slow, controlled, waiting. The plantation moved on, unaware. Samuel continued his boasting. Marianne her mockery. Edward his drunken laughter. Cain his whip and his boots. They thought they were untouchable. They thought he was silent. They thought silence meant surrender. They were wrong. That was when Ezekiel stopped being human. Not to them, he never was, but to himself. He became fire and iron. He became the storm. And the storm was coming. The antagonists, Samuel Fairchild was the plantation's crown. He wore dark coats even in the sweltering summer, his collars stiff with starch, his cravat tied in perfect knots. His voice was deep, smooth when he wanted it to be, but sharp as a knife when he gave orders. He believed in order, his order. At night, he retreated to his study, where he drank whiskey and counted profits by candlelight. He left his keys on the desk beside his ledger, a habit born of arrogance. He believed no one dared touch what was his. Samuel's cruelty was not in sudden lashings or loud commands. His cruelty was in ownership. He took children from mothers without a pause. He sent men south to the slave markets when the fields grew too full. He spoke of people as if they were weights of cotton, numbers to be moved. He believed himself a god in his own kingdom, and his kingdom was built on chains. Marianne Fairchild was sugar over rot. She smiled at guests with charm, her dresses bright with silks, her hair arranged with care. She played the piano in the parlor, her fingers gliding gracefully across ivory keys. But when the doors closed, her eyes hardened. She scolded women for crying when their children were sold. She withheld food from families as punishment for imagined slights. She whispered poison into Samuel. Elle's ear. This one is lazy. That one should be sold. That girl is too bold. She liked to play at kindness. A sweet word in the morning, a pat on the head for a child. But the same night, she would see to it that the child's mother was whipped for failing to curtsy. Her cruelty was small, deliberate, like needles stuck into skin. Thomas Cain was the whip itself. He carried it always, coiled at his hip, sometimes stroking the handle as if it were alive. He was tall, his skin weathered from sun, his eyes pale as washed bone. His laughter was sharp, cutting through the yard whenever someone stumbled. He chewed tobacco constantly, spitting brown streaks in the dirt, and the smell of it clung to him. Cain's cruelty was open, direct. He struck without warning, without cause. He took what he wanted from women in the cabins, leaving them broken and ashamed. He punished men until their bodies gave out. He believed fear was the only language worth speaking, and he loved speaking it. Edward Fairchild, the younger son, was the weakest, and yet dangerous in his own way. He was 23, thin and pale, with soft hands unfit for labor. He wore suits too fine for the plantation, his hair slicked back with oil, his lips always wet with drink. He staggered through nights in laughter, his voice carrying across the halls of the big house. Edward's cruelty was childish, but cruel. He mocked the enslaved like they were toys, calling them names, throwing food at them for his amusement. He liked to corner women, slurring promises and threats in the same breath. He was sloppy, careless, but still dangerous because no one dared deny him. Ezekiel named them one by one as he worked. Samuel, Marianne, Cain, Edward. He whispered their names like curses. He tasted each one like metal on his tongue. The planning. By day, Ezekiel bent iron. By night, he bent silence into steel. He studied the study, Samuel's retreat. He noticed that Samuel always retired there with Waid. Ski after dinner, reading ledgers until his eyes grew heavy. He left the keys on the desk, and when the candle burned low, he drifted upstairs, careless, arrogant. He studied Marianne's wine cellar visits. She carried her lantern down the narrow steps after supper, always alone, her silk skirts whispering against the stone walls. She liked to linger, smelling corks, tasting sips, pretending she was more refined than she was. He studied Cain's patrols. The overseer circled the cabins like a wolf. His boots struck rhythm. Step, 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 pause. Sometimes he lingered outside a door, listening. Sometimes he rattled the handle. Sometimes he went inside. He studied Edward's drunkenness. The boy left the parlor late, swaying, singing off-key, spilling liquor down his vest. He staggered to the stair rail, clutched it with soft hands, and stumbled upward, often alone. Each detail was a thread. Ezekiel wove them together into a net. He wasn't rushing. He wasn't reckless. He wasn't broken. He was burning, slow, controlled, waiting. The atmosphere before the storm. The fields were heavy with summer heat. The air shimmered, thick with insects, the cotton leaves drooping. Work slowed, bodies bent with exhaustion. Cain's whip cracked louder in those days, echoing against the hot air. At night, storms gathered. Lightning flickered on the horizon, and the sky growled low. Rain would come, but not yet. The air was swollen, waiting to burst. Ezekiel felt it in his chest. The storm outside mirrored the storm within. He kept his silence, kept his routine. But every ember of the forge whispered closer, closer. The other men noticed his stillness. They saw his eyes burning as he worked. They felt the charge when he passed, but no one spoke. In silence, they understood. The first weapon, he chose the hammer. It was ordinary, a blacksmith's hammer, square-headed, the handle worn smooth by use, but Ezekiel had shaped it to his hand, balanced it for a swing that could crush bone. He held it in the dim forge one night, lifting it, lowering it, listening to its promise. The hammer had always built. Now it would break. He whispered the first name, Cain. Cain's vulnerability. Cain prided himself on his patrols. He believed his presence alone was enough to keep fear alive. But he was careless in his own confidence. He walked the same paths, at the same hours. He always paused outside Lydia's cabin, as if daring Ezekiel to react. His boots clicked in rhythm, and he never broke it. That was Cain's weakness. Pattern. Arrogance. Ezekiel knew where he would be when he would be there, and what he would carry. The whip at his hip, the smirk on his lips. Cain would be the first. The air grew still, not quiet, still like breath holding itself back. Ezekiel lay awake that night, staring at the roof beams of the cabin. Lydia slept beside Ruth, her breaths shallow, her face pale even in dreams. Ezekiel's hands curled into fists. He didn't run. He didn't hide. He walked. He walked to the forge, lifted the hammer, and stepped into the night. The storm was about to break. The night was swollen with heat, pressing against the cabins, clinging to skin like wet cloth. Clouds gathered over the horizon, their bellies heavy with lightning, their edges glowing faint with restless fire. The plantation slept uneasy, its silence threaded with crickets and the distant lowing of cattle. But Ezekiel did not sleep. He rose quietly from his pallet, his breath slow, measured. Ruth stirred in her corner, but did not speak. Lydia shifted in her dreams, murmuring faintly, a ghost of a song caught in her throat. Ezekiel stepped over the threshold and into the night. He didn't run. He didn't hide. He walked. The forge still smelled of ash, its coals faintly glowing under grey dust. He knelt by the loose boards and lifted them, careful, slow. The hammer waited. He held it in his hand, feeling its weight. The wood was warm, familiar. It had built, bent, shaped. Tonight it would break. He whispered the name. Cain. The ambush. Cain's boots had a rhythm. Step, step, pause. Step, step, pause. The sound carried across the yard, a predator's heartbeat. Ezekiel waited in the shadow of the forge, his body still, his breath shallow. The whip hung loose at Cain's hip, coiled like a snake. He chewed, spat, muttered to himself as he made his rounds. He paused outside a cabin door, Lydia's. His shadow spilled across the wall inside. Ezekiel stepped forward. The hammer was heavy but steady, balanced perfectly in his grip. His feet sank into the dirt without a sound. Cain heard nothing. Then the hammer came down. It landed with a sound like wet wood splitting. Cain's skull cracked under the blow, his jaw snapping sideways. His body jerked, eyes wide, but no cry came. Only a strangled grunt as blood sprayed from his mouth. Ezekiel didn't hesitate. He swung again, the hammer whistling through the air, landing with a sickening crunch against Cain's temple. The overseer dropped to his knees, his whip sliding uselessly into the dirt. Cain's pale eyes rolled back. His mouth opened, tried to shape a word, maybe a curse, maybe a plea, but only blood bubbled. Ezekiel's face was calm, his breaths steady. The hammer rose once more, the hammer fell. Bone shattered, splitting like brittle stone. Cain's body collapsed fully, his head caved, his blood pooling fast and dark, soaking into the earth. 1 down, 3 to go. The aftermath of Cain. Ezekiel stood over the body, chest rising, falling. He didn't tremble. He didn't weep. He listened to the night. The crickets still sang. The cabins remained silent. No one had seen. No one had cried out. The storm clouds overhead rumbled faintly, covering the sound of death with nature's growl. Ezekiel bent, lifted the whip from Cain's side. He coiled it tight, slid it into his belt. The overseer's weapon, once used to carve pain into flesh, now belonged to him. Each blow was not just an act. It was a name reclaimed. Lydia's tears, Ruth's silence. The boy dragged through the dirt. The women who had hidden from Cain's boots. All of them sat with Ezekiel in that moment. He turned, left the body cooling in the dirt, and walked back toward the forge. He did not run. He did not hide. He walked. The plantation. Unaware, morning came with heavy rain. Thunder cracked and the sky split open, pouring water across the fields. The ground turned to mud, soaking Cain's blood into its black veins until no trace remained. The Fairchilds cursed the storm, fretting over delayed work, but they did not yet notice Cain's absence. Overseers often wandered, drinking, gambling, sleeping off indulgence. It would be hours, maybe a day, before questions sharpened. Ezekiel worked the forge as though nothing had changed. Sparks rose, metal rang, his arms moved steady. His face betrayed nothing, but inside, the fire had shifted. He whispered again. Samuel, Marianne, Edward. The second weapon. The knife waited. He pulled it from its hiding place beneath the boards, ran his thumb along the leather-wrapped handle. The blade was long, narrow, dark. It caught no light. Silent. Deadly. If the hammer was thunder, the knife was lightning. It would be for Samuel. Samuel Fairchild's routine. The master retired to his study each night. After supper he drank brandy, counted profits, reviewed ledgers. The candlelight cast shadows across his books, his quill scratching as he tallied lives like numbers. When his eyes grew heavy, he stumbled upstairs, leaving the keys on the desk, careless in his arrogance. Samuel believed no hand would ever touch what was his. But Ezekiel's silence wasn't surrender. It was the storm waiting for the crack. Approached to the study, the night after Cain's death, Ezekiel waited until the house quieted. Lanterns dimmed, the sound of laughter faded, rain pattered faint against the roof. He moved like steam, slow, quiet, necessary. Barefoot, he stepped across the yard, slipped through the shadows of the veranda and into the hall. The boards creaked under his weight, but the storm's growl masked it. The study door was ajar, light spilling faint. Inside, Samuel sat slouched at the desk, quill in hand, eyes drooping. The brandy glass half empty. The keys glittered faint on the wood. Ezekiel's knife was steady in his hand. The execution. He stepped inside. Samuel looked up, startled, confusion clouding his face. What? The knife flashed. It slid into flesh with a sound like cloth tearing, quick, clean. Samuel gasped, eyes wide, mouth opening in disbelief. The quill fell, rolling across the desk. Ezekiel pressed the blade deeper, twisting. Blood bubbled, spilled across the ledger, staining profits in crimson. Samuel choked, gurgled, reached a trembling hand toward Ezekiel's chest. His lips moved. A word. Maybe why? Maybe God. Ezekiel's eyes did not soften. His voice was low, steady. One for Lydia. He pulled the blade free. Blood sprayed, warm, wet, streaking across papers, dripping to the floor. Samuel collapsed forward, his cheek smashing into his own ledger, eyes glazing, lips still moving without sound. One down, two to go. Ezekiel's calm. He wiped the blade on Samuel's coat, leaving the master in his pool of wealth and blood. He took the keys from the desk, slid them into his pocket. The room smelled of iron and brandy, the candle flickering against red-stained pages. Ezekiel turned, walked from the study. He didn't run. He didn't hide. He walked. The next names: Marianne, Edward. Their time would come. The Fairchild house was silent, except for the storm rattling its shutters. Samuel's body slumped over his ledgers, blood soaking the paper, dripping in slow streams onto the rug. Upstairs, footsteps shifted as servants settled in their quarters. Marianne's piano no longer played. Edward's laughter no longer carried. Ezekiel slipped through the hall, knife in hand, the keys heavy in his pocket. He moved like steam, slow, quiet, necessary. Marianne Fairchild. Marianne loved her wine. Every evening she lit her lantern, descended the stone steps into the cool cellar, and lingered among the bottles as though she were some refined lady of Europe instead of a mistress of chains. She liked to touch the corks, read the labels, hum faintly to herself. She never hurried. That night, she carried her lantern as usual, its glow bobbing down the cellar stairs. Her silk skirts whispered against the stone, her perfume mixing with the damp air of aged barrels. She set the lantern on a shelf, uncorked a bottle, and poured herself a glass, humming low, savoring her own ritual. She didn't hear him at first. The knife was dark, silent. Ezekiel waited in the shadows between the racks, breathing slow, his eyes fixed on her. He remembered every smile she'd given at another's pain, every soft word before ordering punishment, every time she had mocked a child's tears. She turned, lifting the glass to her lips. That was when she saw him. Her eyes widened. The glass slipped, shattered against the stone. "What?" The keel knife flashed. It slid across her throat with a sound like paper tearing. Her voice caught in a gasp, turning to a wet choke. She dropped the bottle, clutching at her neck as blood poured between her fingers. Her lantern flickered, casting her shadow wide on the wall. She staggered back against the shelf, knocking bottles that tumbled, burst, spilled red across the floor like echoes of her own life pouring out. Marianne gurgled, eyes wide with disbelief. She tried to speak. Perhaps Samuel's name, perhaps a prayer, but only blood bubbled at her lips. Ezekiel's face was calm, his hand steady. "One for Ruth," he whispered. Her body slid down the wall, skirt spreading, blood mixing with wine, the scent sharp, metallic, cloying. Her lantern guttered low. One down, one to go. Edward Fairchild. Upstairs, Edward laughed. The storm outside had driven him to drink more heavily than usual. His voice carried down the corridor, singing off-key, slurring words. The clink of glass against wood echoed as he poured another round. He staggered from the parlor, bottle in hand, stumbling into the hall. His vest was stained with liquor, his cheeks flushed. He muttered to himself, cursing the storm, cursing his father for not joining him, cursing his mother for being dull. Ezekiel waited in the shadow at the base of the stairs. The hammer was gone, the knife slick, but tonight he chose the hook. The iron curve gleamed faint in the candlelight, its point sharpened to a cruel edge. Edward lurched forward, gripping the stair rail, swaying. "Cain! Cain, where are you? Damn you, fetch me another!" His voice cracked, sloppy, dripping with arrogance. Ezekiel stepped into the light. Edward froze, blinking, his eyes clouded with drink. "What? Who?" The hook struck. It sank into Edward's shoulder, tearing flesh, catching bone. He screamed, a high, shrill sound that broke against the storm outside. Blood poured instantly, soaking his fine shirt. Ezekiel pulled, steady, relentless. The hook ripped deeper, shredding muscle, dragging Edward down the stairs. His bottle shattered, liquor splashing across the wood, mingling with blood. Edward shrieked, flailed, clawed at the rail. "Please! Please don't!" His words choked on sobs, on terror. Ezekiel's face never changed. His silence was colder than any plea. The hook tore free with a sound like cloth ripping, leaving Edward gasping, clutching at the wound. He stumbled, fell backward, his body crashing against the steps. Ezekiel advanced, the hook poised. Edward tried to crawl, his hands slipping in his own blood. "Please, I'll give you—" The hook came down. It buried itself in his chest, piercing, pulling. Edward's eyes bulged, his mouth opened wide in a scream that turned into a gurgle. Blood sprayed, splattering across the steps, across Ezekiel's arms. "One for Joseph," Ezekiel whispered. Edward's body convulsed once, twice, then stilled. His head lolled sideways, his lips trembling as his last breath left him in a wet sigh. One down, none to go. The calm after the storm, the house was silent. No more laughter, no more humming, no more commands. The master lay over his ledger. The mistress bled among her wine. The son sprawled on the stairs, hook in chest, mouth frozen in terror, and the overseer rotted in the dirt outside. The Fairchilds were gone. Ezekiel stood in the hall, blood dripping from his hands, the hook heavy in his grip. His breaths were steady, his eyes calm. He listened to the storm pounding outside, the thunder rolling, the rain washing against the windows. He didn't run. He didn't hide. He walked. Back through the halls, out the door, across the yard, into the no-cha. The discovery. By dawn the storm had passed, leaving the air thick and damp, the ground soaked. The enslaved rose to their bell, gathered in the yard, waiting for orders. But the overseer's boots did not sound. The master did not appear. The mistress's voice did not call. Whispers spread. Fear mingled with something else, something sharper, brighter. It was a young house servant who found Samuel first, slumped over his desk, his blood blackened against parchment. Her scream rang through the halls. Others rushed, found Marianne in her cellar, her skirts ruined, her lantern cold. Then Edward on the stairs, his chest torn open, eyes staring blank. And finally, Cain in the yard, face crushed, whip gone. The house erupted in panic. Servants ran, slaves whispered, riders were sent for the sheriff. And Ezekiel? He stood in the yard, hammer and hook gone, his hands empty. His face was still, unreadable. He did not run. He did not hide. When they came for him, he lifted his wrists. The arrest. The sheriff rode hard with his men, their pistols drawn, their voices sharp. They found Ezekiel standing in the open, his shirt still stained. He did not resist when they bound his hands, when they dragged him toward the horses. The enslaved watched from the cabins. Some covered their mouths. Some wept. Some bowed their heads, not in sorrow, but in awe. Her silence wasn't always surrender. Sometimes it's a storm waiting for a crack in the sky. And Ezekiel had been that storm. The trial approaches. Word spread fast through Natchez. A slave had killed not just an overseer, but an entire family. The Fairchilds, one of the oldest names in the county, wiped out in a single night. The trial would come. The punishment was certain. But the story had already begun to move. Whispered from cabin to cabin, field to field, Ezekiel Brown had named them one by one. And one by one, they had fallen. The jail in Natchez smelled of damp straw and rusted iron. The walls sweated with humidity, the air thick with mildew. Ezekiel sat in the darkness, chains at his wrists and ankles, his back straight against the cold stone. His clothes were stiff with dried blood. His hands bore stains that would not wash away. But his eyes burned steady. He wasn't broken. He was burning, slow, controlled, waiting. The trial, the courthouse was packed. Whites from across the county crowded the benches, eager to see the man who had dared raise his hand against one of their own. The Fairchild name carried weight, and vengeance was demanded. Ezekiel was led in under heavy guard. Shackles clanked with each step, but his walk was calm. He didn't stumble, didn't lower his head. He moved like steam, slow, quiet, necessary. The judge, A man with jowls heavy from years of brandy called the trial to order. Witnesses were brought, house servants trembling as they described finding the bodies, neighbors testifying to the Fairchild's standing in the community. When it was Ezekiel's turn, the courtroom fell into silence. The sheriff asked, "Did you kill Samuel Fairchild, his wife Marianne, his son Edward, and his overseer Thomas Kane?" Ezekiel's voice was steady. "Yes." A murmur rippled through the crowd, shock and outrage mingling. The sheriff pressed on. "Why?" Ezekiel raised his eyes. His voice did not waver. Because silence was no longer enough. Gasps echoed. The judge banged his gavel, but Ezekiel did not speak again. The verdict was already written before the trial began. Guilty. Death by hanging. The waiting. They kept him in his cell for 3 nights before the execution. Word spread quickly, carried on whispers, carried by travelers, carried by the enslaved who overheard their masters talking. In the cabins, across this Mississippi, his name traveled like a current. Ezekiel Brown, the blacksmith who struck back, the man who named them one by one and sent them into the dark. Her silence wasn't always surrender. Sometimes it's a storm waiting for a crack in the sky. And Ezekiel had been the crack. The execution. Dawn broke grey on the morning of June 16th, 1854. Clouds stretched across the horizon, heavy with rain, though no storm yet fell. The gallows stood tall in the town square, its wood rough, its rope freshly coiled. They led Ezekiel out in chains. The crowd had gathered, pressing shoulder to shoulder, their eyes hungry to see the end of him. Some spat, some cursed, some shouted prayers. The sheriff read the sentence. Ezekiel Brown, for the murders of Samuel Fairchild, Marianne Fairchild, Edward Fairchild, and Thomas Kane, you are hereby condemned to death by hanging. Ezekiel's eyes swept the crowd. He saw fear. He saw hatred. And in the far edges, he saw something else. Enslaved men and women who had come under guard, their faces still, their eyes wide, burning. He climbed the steps without falter. His chains rattled, but his back stayed straight. He did not run. He did not hide. He walked. The hangman placed the rope around his neck, tightening it against his skin. The sky above grumbled low, a promise of rain. The sheriff asked, "Do you have any last words?" Ezekiel's voice was calm. One for every name they tried to erase. The platform dropped. The rope snapped tight. The storm broke. Rain poured down, drenching the gallows, soaking the crowd, washing the dust into mud. The aftermath, they buried Ezekiel in an unmarked grave outside town. The whites were eager to erase his name, to strike his story from memory. But memory is not so easily buried. In the cabins, his story was told in whispers. Mothers spoke it to their children at night. Men carried it into the fields with them. Ezekiel Brown, they said. The blacksmith who forged more than iron. The blacksmith who forged vengeance. Each blow he struck was retold, not in fear, but in awe. The hammer, the knife, the hook, the sound of bone cracking like wet wood splitting. The master's ledger stained with blood. The mistress in her cellar of wine. The drunken son on the stairs. The overseer's whip gone silent. They thought they could bury him, but he was fire. Fire spreads. The legend. In time, his name stretched beyond Natchez. Across Mississippi, across Louisiana, across Georgia and Alabama, whispers carried Ezekiel Brown. Some said he had killed 10 men. Others said 100. Some said he escaped the gallows, that the storm had swallowed him, that he lived on in the woods, striking at masters from the shadows. But those who knew the truth understood. He had died, yet in death, he had become more alive than ever. Her silence wasn't always surrender. Sometimes it's a storm waiting for a crack in the sky. And Ezekiel Brown had been the storm. Modern remembrance. Today, his name survives in fragments, in church songs that never made the hymnals, in stories told on porches, passed through generations, in the unmarked graves that dot the South, where memory lingers even when names are gone. The Fairchild Plantation is gone now, its fields overgrown, its house rotted, but the ground is heavy with memory, heavy with the night when Ezekiel Brown chose justice over silence. He wasn't broken. He was burning, slow, controlled, waiting. And when the time came, he struck. Closing, if this story moved you, subscribe, like, and share.